Welcome, new and old friends. I just have a couple things to say, and then the stories will begin. Before you drift off into the dream realm, please remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment. If you'd like to find out about my social links, my website, how to help the channel, check the description box. Now turn off your lights, make sure your doors and windows are locked. It's time to dream. Just to give you a warning, this does have voice acting in it, but there's no real sound effects. I try to make it as smooth as I can for you. But if louder voices and voice acting will wake you up, I highly recommend a different video. With all that being said, let's get on with the story. The Michigan Dogman by frostbrior. I've always been fascinated by urban legends and tales of supernatural creatures. I've heard of the Dogman since I was young, when I first heard the legends playing on the radio. A mysterious creature said to roam the forest of the Great Lakes region, and with my fascination came a sense of wanting to find the creature and see it for myself if it was really out there. Armed with a curious mind and a flashlight, I set out to explore the woods near my hometown. It was an overcast night, with only a dim glow of the stars to guide my path. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves and snaps of twigs sent shivers down my spine. But I pressed on, my curiosity overpowering my unease. Little did I know how much of a mistake it was to ignore my instincts. After what felt like hours of wandering, I stumbled forward, an eerie silence blanketing the forest, as if a switch was flipped and all the sound in the world disappeared. Something drew me towards it, an invisible force urging me to step closer. That's when I surveyed my surroundings in detail and saw it. A pair of glowing amber eyes staring back at me from the shadows. My heart took a beat as the creature revealed itself, a massive canine-like figure standing upright on two legs. Its fur was matted and dark, and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. It was a dogman, and it had fixed its gaze upon me. A primal fear surged through my veins as I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight in the process, and with it but a moment's hesitation, I turned and ran as fast as my legs could carry me. The sound of heavy footsteps pounding behind me growing louder and closer with each passing second. I could hear its snarls and the sharp snap of its jaws, hungry for the chase. My breath grew ragged and my muscles screamed in protest, but the adrenaline fueled my desperate sprint. Branches whipped against my face, and the forest floor seemed to rise up to trip me. But I pushed through, determined to escape the clutches of the monstrous dogman. My lungs burned and my vision blurred as I reached the edge of the woods. My house stood just a few yards away, its light providing a beacon of hope. Summoning the last reserves of my strength, I sprinted across the yard and flung open the front door. I slammed it shut, panting heavily as I leaned against it, my heart racing in my chest. I felt a mixture of relief and terror as I looked through the window and saw the dogman standing at the edge of the clearing, its gaze fixed upon me. Its mouth curled into a wicked snarl, revealing sharp, glistening teeth, and what looked like a cruel and deranged smile. For a moment, we locked eyes, a battle of will between human and beast. I know I had escaped, but the encounter had left an indelible mark on my soul. The dogman had shown me the darkness lurking just beyond the realm of our understanding, and it was a sight I would never forget. To this day, I'm plagued with the memories of that night. The image of the dogman's glowing eyes and sinister grin haunts my dreams, a constant reminder of the terrors that exist in the shadows. I warn anyone who dares to venture into the Michigan wilderness, beware the dogman's domain. It may be an urban legend to some, but for those who encounter its malevolence, it is all too real. The forest hides its secrets well, and the dogman waits patiently for the next victim. Ever since then, I haven't been able to look at the woods without a shudder going down my spine, hoping to not see the amber eyes staring back at me. If I were to give you all any advice, it would be, do not go out at night. They don't tell you that the worst part of the job is the smell. After all these years I've worked and all the people I wasn't able to save, I can't enjoy barbecue or fire pit, can't go camping, can't have a fucking s'more without thinking of their burning bodies. Don't Tell a Soul by LoFo.
Who the fuck was that, Jess?
I could hear my mom's latest boyfriend scream at her through the thin walls on our single-wide trailer.
For the last time, you know him. His name is Kenny. Nothing happened.
I could hear my mom scream back. Her voice was hoarse, trying to hold back tears. I listened to a nightly back and forth while switching my gaze from my broken, oscillating fan in the corner of my broom closet of my bedroom, and out into the dark Kentucky countryside through my bedroom window. I never liked listening to those arguments, but at some point, they became so regular that I was able to tune them out most of the time. Some nights, like tonight, were different. I found myself hanging off of every word to a near pointless argument that I cared next to nothing about. They always ended one of two ways. The first was a round of equal parts rough and loud makeup sex, and the other was Jimmy getting kicked out. At the same time, my mom spends the rest of the weekend at Gators, a local dive bar for trailer trash like us, known for serving almost any paying customer, regardless of age, before coming home with a new boyfriend who never had less than 2 DUIs. After the first bottle of whiskey smashed against the wall, I decided I didn't want to stay in the trailer that night. It wasn't unusual. I had a habit of crashing with friends for weeks on end, and in 1996 there was nothing I could be tracked with, not that anyone would have. I cracked open my window about halfway and slid out into the cold November air. I stuffed my hands in the pouch of my hoodie and began to walk to the center of the trailer park. As I drew closer, an ever-present flickering glow began to reflect off the vinyl sidings, and grew stronger and stronger against the side of each passing single wide. Rounding the last trailer is met with a Sunday bonfire. Over a week, most people save up all of their excess paper and cardboard waste to burn every Sunday night. Around the fire sat 3 slowly decaying couches, the upholstery looking more like rags loosely tossed over the frame and cushions. Jim sat on the closest couch, back to me, nursing whatever the cheapest beer at the gas station had been that day. His eyes were fixed on the ever-dying fire, only 15 minutes at most from turning into dying embers. Without saying a word, I grabbed the last beer from the 6-pack and took a seat beside him to watch the fire die. We sat for maybe 5 minutes before he finally said anything.
New boyfriend?
He wasn't looking at me, still fixated on the fire. I answered by taking another long sip.
Damn.
He took the final sip before crushing the can and tossing it into the fire to deform even further slowly. He stood to his feet and stretched an arm out to help me up.
Come on.
I took his hand and pulled myself up, becoming a little lightheaded as I gained my footing. I followed him without another word to his rusting, rust-red Ford pickup parked behind his trailer. Jimmy had become like an older brother. He was almost 7 years older than me. He was growing facial hair while I was still figuring out multiplication. When he had gotten his license and his family kicked him out, we didn't see much of him for almost a year. And then one day he pulled right back into Bronze Anchor Meadows, the sign even more decrepit than when he had left. He marched right up to a trailer, keys in hand, and walked inside. No one knew what exactly he did for work. Having known him for as long as I had, I guess he did whatever he was paid. He never worked for one sole person or company. When he finally came back, he was almost like a god to the younger kids. Gain a single wide all to yourself at 18? Unheard of for us. Looking back on it, it's almost laughable what we thought the heights of luxury was. I climbed into the passenger seat before slamming the door that was so badly in need of an oil shut. He slid the key into the ignition and shifted into first before pulling out of the park. I reached under my seat and pulled out the small shoebox filled with cassettes. His selection was small: Motorhead, Metallica, and a few other bootleg country tapes mixed in with everything from black metal to Wu-Tang.
Do you have anything good?
I asked. My voice was hoarse with disuse. I hadn't thought about it, but that was probably the first time I had spoken in 2 days.
That is it.
Jimmy said, motioning to the box, not taking his eyes off the road.
Make something good out of it.
I kept pawing around the box until I settled on Nirvana's Nevermind album. I opened the case and slid the worn 5-year-old cassette into the filthy tape deck. When I hit play, track 1, Smells Like Teen Spirit, roared to life. I adjusted the volume and asked,
Where are we going?
Jimmy stayed silent.
Are we just driving, or...
He cut me off.
You want to make some money?
His question caught me off guard. I hesitated.
How much?
He started doing math in his head. Every half second that passed felt longer and longer. Nirvana was completely tuned out.
I'd say around 25 grand each.
I felt my soul leave my body for a moment. I never heard someone talk about that much money, let alone seen it.
How?
I'm sorry?
He finally looked over at me.
How are we getting it?
You remember when I took off a few years ago?
Yes.
I met this guy. He collects things.
What things?
I half expected him to tell me we're on the way to rob an art gallery.
All kinds of stuff. He showed me around his trophy room once. All kinds of things. A lot of old things. Most of them looked like they were about 5 seconds from turning into dust.
He seemed to be excited to be telling me all about this, like the weight was finally being lifted off his shoulders.
Nate, this is your fucking payday, man.
He wasn't wrong. $35,000 can carry me a lot further than the trailer park I'd spent most of my life in. I shut my mouth. I didn't know how to respond, or if I should respond. This was how he made his money. He was nothing better than a thief. He must have sensed this because he switched gears, trying to reassure me that everything was on the up and up.
Listen, all I'm doing is putting some cool things in a museum. Like those Indiana Jones movies you like. No one gets hurt, and I get paid. Win-win, right?
Looking back, it was clear that he was doing his best to convince himself more than me that he was still a good person who was doing a morally just thing. I caved.
What is it?
He pulled up to a gas station, expectantly asking if I was in. It felt like some sort of shitty Ocean's 11 parody. I didn't know how to answer. Every fiber in my bones screamed at me not to.
Nothing changes if nothing changes.
His words ripped me right from my mental pros and cons list.
What?
You don't like it at home, right?
He was right.
You're never gonna leave if you keep floating through your life. Am I wrong?
He wasn't.
This is your chance to change that.
He slid the gear shifter into park, got out, and began moving towards the building to pay. I looked at the fuel gauge. Half a tank left. He just wanted me to think about it. He knew how deep and how well he had braided those words into my brain. When he finally came back, beer in hand, I answered him. I was in, and I wanted to be. Dollar signs were the only thing I saw, the only thing I wanted to see.
What are we taking?
The guy wants this charm.
He held up a circle with his fingers as he started the engine again.
It's a Haitian thing.
Haitian?
The word felt odd leaving my mouth, like my mouth had never made that sound before. I mouthed it a few more times to shake off the unfamiliarity.
We're robbing Haitians.
No, just a religion.
I began to ask another question before he cut me off.
Look, I don't know what it's called, or how old it is, or whatever else you want to ask. All I know is that some group has set up camp on an old plantation a few hours away. They've kept to themselves mostly. They hold these rituals or something. He showed me photos, but I didn't get it. Something to do with chicken's blood?
Chicken's blood?
With every new sentence, this 25,000 sound less and less real.
Yes, chicken's blood. Look, I don't get it either.
We spent the rest of the night talking about this. The more Jimmy talked, the more clear it became just how little he knew about what we were being paid to find. Again, looking back, I should have backed out right then and there. But money is a fickle thing. People will choose money over their soul 9 times out of 10. This has always been and always will be the case. From Judas all the way up to me, the cycle will always repeat, long after I'm dead and gone. He dropped me off that night close to sunrise. Questions still dart through my mind at 1,000,000 miles an hour. 3 days later, he picked me up again, this time with another guy, Grant. Tall and lanky, dressed in dark jeans and a black construction hoodie. Similar to Jimmy, sat in the passenger seat. I climbed over him and took my place in the middle of the bench seat before taking off. The plantation was only 50 miles past the Kentucky-Tennessee border. We parked the car at a local diner and set off on foot for the 3-mile hike across a privatized forest and a storm evacuation trail. When we finally got close, the other two stopped. Grant pulled a handgun out of his waistband and pulled back the slider to make sure that there was a round in the chamber. Jimmy pulled one out from his waistband and the other from his backpack he had slung over his left shoulder. He handed me one while checking the chamber on his.
What do we need these for?
What do you think?
When Grant finally spoke more than 2 words to me, they were more mocking. He did his best to put up a wall for everyone. Mine just happened to be well constructed out of snide remarks and contempt.
You said no one would get hurt.
I said, grabbing the gun from him.
And they won't.
Jimmy said, tucking the gun back into his waistband.
Just some insurance.
He put both hands up and let loose a grin constructed of his crooked and ever-darkening teeth. His warped smile was hard to find comforting. I tucked the gun back into the back of my waistband and covered it with my shirt, a black band shirt I had bought for $2 about a year before at a thrift store. We kept walking. Kudzoon vines kept wrapping around my feet, forcing me to stop every few seconds, and either yank them from the ground with a quick and forceful tug, or by rolling my ankle until they fell off naturally. By the time we finally crossed the ridge, we had a clear view of what I will forever refer to as a compound. A large metal fence, topped in barbed wire, surrounded by several small one-room cabins that didn't look to have been refurbished since their construction in the late 1800s. People moved in and around each cabin and each other swiftly. Each person moved in an inherent sense of purpose. Some carried large boxes or tools, and others just moved. From a distance, they resembled a colony of ants. We sat perched on the hilltop for what felt like years in complete silence, watching the people go about their daily lives. Just from sitting there, everyone seemed complete and fulfilled. No one person inside the fence seemed unhappy or dissatisfied with their life. They had their own chores around the compound to do, and at night they slept in one of the former slave quarters with their families. After the sun finished setting, Jimmy was the first to move. He flipped his bag around and unzipped the top pouch before pulling out a pair of rust bolt clippers that looked like they had just spent the last several years in neglect. Once we made our way through the fence, we left the gate hanging open in case we felt the need for a quick exit. As I passed through, it snagged my shirt on the sharp edge of the chain link, tearing a small hole along my ribcage. I wrestled it free and kept my place in the middle of the pack. We found ourselves staring at the back of the compound. About a mile straight ahead sat the rotting white chapel at the top of the hill, its sides having been decorated with all sorts of symbols meant to ward off evil spirits or whatever these people were supposed to believe in. When we made our way up to the base of the back of the staircase of the chapel, things felt wrong. My consciousness hadn't gotten to me yet, but everything felt too easy. I let these thoughts overcome my subconscious, and soon they were all I could think about. They raced across my mind as Jimmy cut the padlock to the cellar door that sat next to the staircase. Grant helped by lifting the large oak doors and shoving it into the mixture of grass and dirt that the hinges allowed it to reach. Jimmy pulled a flashlight out of his bag of wonders, and Grant flicked a Zippo open to light his cigarette before descending the staircase, lighter in hand. I followed behind, stopping to take in the outside world, taking note of every detail I could before lowering. Everything from the symbols carved into the earth to the bonfire in the center of the living quarters that is now just a smoldering pile of ash and charred wood. Ducking my head below the large beam, nearly smacking it as I did so, my eyes struggled to adjust to the suffocating darkness, only focusing on the two separate light sources frantically scanning each corner of the room looking for a way upstairs. Eventually, Grant's lighter illuminated the rusty remains of what had once been a ladder. The bolts hung freely from the brackets that were clinging to the ladder frame by the ancient welds. Jimmy shook it to test its strength before remarking that it felt good enough. Jimmy went up first, lifting the hatch at the top just enough to peek through. The light above spilled across his face before he pushed the hatch the rest of the way to open and climb through. When I finally had my turn to surface, I was met with two lines of candles stretching for what seemed like miles. In reality, it was really only 30 feet or so. The lines ran parallel to make room for someone to walk. It reminded me of a wedding or any formal event that involved someone walking down an aisle. The hatch we ascended through was located in the very back of the rather large one-room chapel directly behind the altar. When I finally found my footing, I spent an extra few seconds taking in the entire room, allowing a few quick breaths to calm the ever-rising wave of anxiety I had allowed to grow in the cellar. My body rocked back and forth on the aging wood flooring, laying out a slow creak with every small shifting of my weight. To my left, Jimmy and Grant had found another handmade wooden cabinet locked shut with another padlock that seemed like no match for the neglected wire cutters after a few attempts. My eyes scanned the windows as they opened the cabinet doors and began rummaging through its contents. As I finished the first lap, my eyes stopped on the now roaring bonfire, where what seemed like seconds ago was nothing more than a smoldering pile of ashes. I tried for their attention, getting shrugged off as they pulled out pieces of dirty cheesecloth wrapped around a large disc. I yelled and Grant smacked his head on the top of the inside of the cabinet.
What?
He yelped, holding his hand to the back of his head. I pointed out the window and their eyes widened in sync. Never been religious. As we began to turn heel and run out the door, Grant refused to follow. I was baptized by my grandmother when I was first born, but I quickly fell out of the church. I've always found that most jaw-dropping moments are when the atheists drop to their knees. I was no exception. I began mouthing the Hail Mary over and over again. I began to do this when my eyes caught what he was looking at. Amongst the splintering rafters of the chapter sat perched a tall and gangly creature. The emaciated figure was hunched over, its knees in its chest, as its massive bony hands clasped firmly around the wooden beams as if they were a twig. Its face was difficult to describe, as if every person I had ever met were formed into one being. It smiled at me with perfect snow-white teeth that clashed with the rancid filth that covered its skin in a thick layer. Its hair drifted with the wind in thin strands. With its head cocked to the side, it began to backpedal away from it slowly, maintaining eye contact as I did so. When I finally built up the courage to turn my back, I was met with Jimmy yanking on the handle to the back door. When that didn't work, he resolved to kick it down. When that also failed, I turned around to see the thing standing a hair away from paralyzed Grant. Now that it stood on its own feet, I was able to guess that it was no less than 8 feet tall. It stared into him unblinking, its slow, methodical breathing turning into fast, deep panting. Its chest inflamed more and more with each breath, rising and falling faster with every passing second. I took too long staring at it because when I was finally able to move my eyes from this sudden fixation, Jimmy was gone. Next to me, the hatch was wide open. I looked back one more time and Grant had a hand wrapped around his mouth, the fingers clasped at the back of his scalp. He tried his best to scream, but was only able to manage a soft, muffled whimper. The creature lifted its other hand up and brushed it down the front of Grant's face. He had stopped trying to scream by now. Now he stood there panting in unison with the thing, eyes wide. It dropped its grin. I don't know what's more unsettling, the ending rows of perfect teeth or the complete absence of any emotion on his face. It lifted 2 fingers with its unoccupied hand and began tracing the features of Grant's face. I ducked my head below the floor when it slowly pushed towards his eyes. I slammed the hutch shut above me, but that didn't stop the shrill. Pain wailed from penetrating the floor. The ladder gave out from the wall as I did my best to scurry down as fast as possible. I was pinned to the floor. It must have weighed only 60 pounds at most, but I still found myself struggling to lift it from my chest. After struggling to roll out from under it, I managed to shove it off to the side, leaving a thin, deep, and long slash down my forearm. Blood began to emanate from it almost immediately. I held on to what I could and squeezed as hard as my hand would let me in a futile attempt to stop the now gushing blood from pouring out of my arm. I looked over. The cellar door was left wide open. I pawed at my waist, hoping against hope that I had actually worn a belt for once, but I hadn't. This sudden realization led to my heart racing even faster. Thus, more blood spilled from my arm. I began to hobble my way to the steps. My vision began to go in and out of focus. I began to feel my legs go numb underneath me as the saturation of everything around me shifted. I was barely able to pull myself up over the last step. I flopped onto my back and stared at the quickly darkening stars as I tried my best to make right with God through my delirium. I was halfway through my half-hearted plea for mercy when everything faded out. The only way I can best describe the feeling after waking up is shock. I felt everything in my body seize as if I had come back from the dead all at once. The next 2 things I noticed were the inability to move my hands or legs. The next was the bizarre heat that ran up and down my entire body, coming from the left of me. I rolled my head over, and I was met with a bonfire only 3 feet away from my nose. I had been tied down. People were crowded around me as I lay unable to move. I thrashed against my restraints to no avail. The adrenaline had worn off by now. My arm burned internally, and every movement felt like I was rubbing glass into the wound. Looking around, I could see several people gathered around me in a circle that wrapped around the fire. No one said a word. Instead, chose to stare at me in silence. I thrashed against my restraints against the pain, all the while screaming whatever ascetics came to mind at whoever could listen. I stopped my thrashing when I noticed the skin and eyeless corpse of Grant impaled on a stake that was covered in now congealed and burnt blood that stretched into the sky from his throat in the center of the fire. Slowly, his exposed muscles and nerves charred darker and darker. I couldn't see past his waist, but I could imagine his feet were no more than ash and bone by that point. From behind me, I could hear Jimmy. I couldn't see, but judging by the noise, he had also just woken up. However, instead of leaving him in his restraints, they cut him free and carried him into my view, still completely silent. One man in a large, filthy, Catholic-style white gown. As he stepped closer to the fire with the aid of a walking stick, he removed the disc from inside the gown and delicately unwrapped it from the cloth. As he did so, a small murmur broke out amongst the crowd that slowly came together to form a hushed prayer in a language I had never heard before. He lifted his stick and affixed the disc to it through the hole in the center and placed it into the fire before turning around to face Jimmy and the 2 men that were holding him. He knelt down to eye level with him and placed his palm onto Jimmy's forehead and began to say a prayer. I pulled around my restraints to gather my range of motion to find that I could no longer feel the gun I had tucked underneath my shirt. Eventually the priest stood back up and grabbed the now white-hot branding iron by the leather-wrapped handle. The 2 men holding Jimmy on his knees stood him up to face me.
Don't you touch him.
Tears welled up in his eyes.
Keep your hands off of him.
One of the men holding him pulled out a small pocket knife and held it to his throat. For one final moment, we locked eyes before he mouthed,
I'm sorry.
The serrated blade ripped across his esophagus. A large, interrupted stream of black-red gore spilled into the bucket that had been placed at his feet. I began to cry and thrashed even harder at my restraints, causing a few of the fresh stitches in my arm to burst. Jimmy dropped limply into the uncut grass where the blood continued to pool after the bucket had been adequately filled. When the priest walked over, he began praying louder. A woman walked up from behind me and ripped my shirt more from where the fence had snagged it earlier, before placing the bucket that had just been at Jimmy's feet, before disappearing back into the crowd. The priest stopped his prayer and lunged the iron into my now exposed skin. Immediate, sweltering pain. I tried to tug away, but that only made the burning worse as he pushed in the iron even more. The stench of melting flesh filled my nostrils. When that failed, I resorted to the one thing I could control. I screamed at the top of my lungs until my throat burned more than my abdomen. The crowd began to chant something in the same language the priest had been praying in. He pulled the iron away and dunked it into a bucket of water below me, the steam bellowing up and obscuring his face. I began hyperventilating while trying to slow my breathing between bursts of frantic and uncontrolled panting. He raised the bucket just above the burn and poured it over. The blood turned the pain from burning into retching. The body isn't meant to fluctuate temperatures that much in such a short amount of time. I rolled away from him as he set the bucket back down. He stepped towards my head and placed a hand on my forehead before beginning to recite the same prayer he had for Jimmy. I yanked my right arm upwards and felt the zip tie restraint give slightly. I pulled it as hard and as fast as I could until it gave up. I mustered every bit of strength I had in my left arm, and I hit the priest as I rolled over and forced the other zip tie apart. My feet came out even easier, only tied down with 2-foot-long sections of rope held together with a loose square knot. Adrenaline had more than kicked in by this point, and I darted behind the cabins towards the general direction where we had entered as fast as my legs would take me. I scrambled under the fence and back to my knees as fast as I could, with several sets of footsteps chasing after me. After what felt like 10 miles, I couldn't muster up the strength to look behind me. After another mile, the sun had finally broken the horizon, and several strands of light poked through the thicket. I finally allowed myself to stop and take a breather. I collapsed at the base of the tree, finally allowing myself to feel the intense burning pain in my side and the throbbing coming from my now mostly clothed arm. I slowed my breathing and began to cry. I bawled my eyes out for what felt like hours when I felt some more air puff up onto the nape of my neck. I flipped around and landed on my back, staring back at me. Hands and feet firmly planted into trees was that thing, smiling as brightly as it had at Grant. I scrambled away and picked up the closest rock to me before holding it like a weapon. The thing began to chuckle at me. It felt warranted the more I thought about it. What was I going to do with a rock? I dropped it and fell to my knees, arms outstretched. I clenched my eyes shut as tightly as possible, waiting to die. When nothing happened, I opened them to lock eyes with the creature, still smiling. In a moment, it had an entire claw on my stomach and was lifted above the ground by my neck. I tried to let out some sort of noise, anything that could tell anyone where I was. Nothing. No sound emerged. I looked down again to watch it rip downwards and my stomach and entrails piled at its feet in a wet clump. In a moment, everything went black as I could feel myself being dropped onto the forest floor. There was no light at the end of the tunnel, and there were no pearly gates. Only a never-ending sea of black. Before everything else followed into this abyss, I could hear it say in a hoarse few words,
Don't tell a soul.
Everything followed into the dark. I was alone, forever falling and flying, everywhere and nowhere at the same time, before everything crashed back around me. I woke up. Not only was I alive, I was home. I was back in the trailer staring out the window as my mom had the same screaming match with her newest boyfriend of the week. I rolled off my bed with a splitting headache, as if all the pain had rushed back to me in an instant. I curled into a ball and began clenching at my head as the argument raged on in the background. All in a moment it went away. I was left on my dirty bedroom floor covered in sweat. I looked down at my arm to find a scar stretching from the inside of my elbow to the base of my wrist. As the bottle smashed against the wall, I lifted my shirt to find another scar. In the days that would follow, Jimmy would go missing. The police never cared that much when he disappeared. My best guess is they stuffed his file in a drawer to never see the light of day again. And soon enough, the community of Bronze Acre Meadows would forget about him. His things were auctioned off by the park owner, and an ad was placed back in the paper. His memory was relegated to a place of a drug-addicted cousin that no one wanted to talk about. One day he was there, the next he wasn't. And this story had a lot of other narrators who helped me bring to life, so let me tell you who they were, in order of first appearance. Narrated by me, 242. Mom's Boyfriend by Evil Outcast. Mom, aka Jess, was by Dark Little Voices Decay. Jimmy was by Dark Little Voices Shade. The main character was As the Raven Dreams. Grant was Count Julius. And lastly was The Creature by Phoenix Fire. And please remember to check out these other narrators. All their links will be in the description box / show notes. My teenage daughter woke me up to check her teeth were still there, which they were, because she said it felt like they'd fallen out while she was sleeping. At her orthodontics appointment a week later, she tried to say I told you so, but struggled given most of her teeth were now hanging from the braces just removed, already rotting from how long they had been detached from her gums. The Haunting of Willowbrook Manor, A Descent into Darkness. By Many Definitions 6775. It was an innocent decision, or so I thought. I had always been fascinated by the supernatural, drawn to the eerie tales that sent shivers down my spine. Little did I know that my curiosity would lead me down a path of terror and despair, into the heart of an otherworldly nightmare. It began when I stumbled upon an obscure ad in a local newspaper. Seeking brave souls, Willowbrook Manor, the most haunted house in the country. The allure was undeniable, and against my better judgment, I decided to embark on this perilous journey. Arriving at Willowbrook Manor, I was greeted by an imposing Victorian mansion, shrouded in an ominous mist, its dilapidated facade alluding to an air of desolation and decay. Despite the chill in the air, I felt an inexplicable warmth tugging at my insides, urging me to explore its haunted halls. Stepping through the creaking double doors, I was enveloped in a suffocating darkness that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. The air was thick with a tangible sense of foreboding. As I cautiously made my way through the labyrinth of corridors, I could hear distant whispers and disembodied footsteps echoing from unseen corners. Rooms that had long been abandoned sprung to life, each with their own spectacle inhabitants. The spirit of a tormented artist, forever trapped in the pursuit of his masterpiece. The ghostly echoes of a child's laughter, accompanied by the phantom cries of a dreamy mother. Shadows danced along the walls, mocking my feeble attempt to escape their clutches. The nights were the worst. As the moon bathed Willowbrook Manor in an ethereal glow, the spirits grew restless, their presence intensifying. The walls seemed to breathe, and the paintings that lined them twisted and contorted into macabre scenes. The anguished cries of the damned resonated through the halls, sending chills down my spine. Sleep became a distant memory as nightmares plagued my every moment. Visions of apparitions with hollow eyes, their spectacled fingers caressing my soul. Dreams of being trapped in a never-ending maze pursued by nameless horrors. Each night was an endless descent into darkness, robbing me of my sanity. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself spiraling deeper into the clutches of the Willowbrook Manor. The line between reality and the supernatural blurred, leaving me questioning my very existence. The spirits seemed to feed off my fear, growing stronger with each passing day. I sought solace in online communities, sharing my experiences and searching for answers. But all I found were others trapped in their own haunted nightmares, their lives forever intertwined with the malevolent forces that plagued Willowbrook Manor. It was a curse that bound us together, a collective suffering that no one else could comprehend. Now, as I sit here in flickering candlelight, writing this desperate account, I can feel the presence of the spirits closing in. Their icy breath caresses my neck, whispering promises of eternal torment. I know that escape is impossible, that I am forever condemned to wander the halls of Willowbrook Manor, a prisoner of my own curiosity. So, dear listener, heed my warning. If you ever come across an invitation to Willowbrook Manor, cast it aside. From within its walls lies a darkness that will consume your very soul. And once you enter, there is no turning back. After I died, I traveled up a long tunnel towards a bright light, and when I reached it, I could feel myself being reborn into a new body. As I opened my tiny eyes for the first time, I looked around, only to see myself emerging from an egg casing with a dozen or so other baby cockroaches. The Great Joy of Locusts by Saturdead. My grandfather, Edgar Eddie Hurrence, passed away in early February. This was the man who inspired me my whole life and encouraged me to pursue whatever whims I was passionate about. When I wanted to be an astronaut, he sent me to space camp. When I wanted to be a soccer player, he got me my first pair of cleats. So, years later, when I wanted to get into aerospace engineering, there was no questions about it. He was there to help. He knew I'd eventually find my way, and that the best thing to do was to encourage me to try and push myself further. I found great success in my work, and I've always been grateful to Eddie for his ceaseless enthusiasm. So when I heard about his sudden deteriorating health, I dropped everything. When you get to your 80s, things can change at a drop of a hat. There's nothing more terrifying than the human condition. But the story I'm about to tell you comes close. I took care of Eddie those last few weeks of his life. We wanted him to be able to spend that time at home with friends and family, and we did whatever we could to make that happen. But Eddie had plans. He didn't want to spend time at home. He wanted to travel one last time. He had this strange idea to go to this little town in South Dakota. I couldn't figure out why, but he was determined. He got this strange shimmer in his eyes whenever he spoke about it. "I gotta go," he said. "Please, I just gotta go." It was a small town northeast of Rapid City. You could barely see it on a map. You could see the houses, but there was no name to it. That's how I got to know about Locust, South Dakota. Eddie died 2 weeks ahead of his planned trip to Locust. His passing was sudden, devastating, and confusing. I never heard him talk of that place before, and there was no real explanation as to why he wanted to go there. So I decided as a final show of gratitude to spread his ashes there. I made a reservation at a motel and drove out there over the weekend. There was no information about the motel I was staying at, what the buildings in the town were used for, or who lived there. It was a whole town of question marks. Not because of anything being hidden, but because no one cared to look closer. This was the kind of town that was just a bunch of houses by the side of the road. The kind of place you pass by, only ever asking yourself who lives in a place like this to begin with. But when the time came, I carefully packed Eddie's bronze urn and took it to the road, not knowing what to expect. I'd never been to South Dakota before. On the first day driving through Rapid City, there was this violent snowfall that almost threw me off the road. Going up to Locust was about as flat terrain as it gets, the endless fields of snow stretching for miles. Not that you could see that far because of the weather, but still. The first night in Locust wasn't anything special. I arrived pretty late, got myself a gas station hot dog from across the street, and crashed in my room. The owner seemed nice enough, a soft-spoken elderly woman called Dottie, who was eager to make sure I had everything I needed for my stay. I crawled into bed, watched some TV, and fell asleep. I left Eddie's urn out. He loved watching late-night television. I figured he'd appreciate me leaving it on. The weather had cleared up by morning. The sun reflecting off the fresh snow was blinding, and there was this awkward humidity in the air. It was still cold, but wearing a jacket made me feel sticky, like a warm ham in a plastic bag. Awful. I brought my backpack, taking Eddie along. I was going to check out the town, ask a few questions, and try to figure out why Gramps wanted to go here so badly. Dottie, the owner, was up early. She asked me all about my plans, if I slept all right, if the water pressure in my shower was okay. I got the impression she didn't see a lot of new people. "I'm actually here for my grandpa," I said. Before I had a chance to elaborate, Dottie lit up like a candle, her smile growing wider and a laugh bubbling up. "How exciting," she said. "Wait, don't tell me. You're Donnie's boy, right? Or is it Hector?" "No, sorry, I wasn't clear. My grandpa never made it here." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that," she sighed. "I'm sure he would have loved our little town." "It's strange," I said. "I don't think he's ever been here. Why would he be so eager to visit?" "None of us have been to heaven either," she said. "But we still wish to see it." She laughed it off and took me to a small dining room. Fresh bacon, eggs, and coffee. A little slice of heaven right there. Dottie had a few other guests that morning. An old couple and a woman in a wheelchair. Just people from the neighborhood, it seemed. The woman in the wheelchair had an oxygen tank and a white mask covering half her face, which she carefully removed to put tiny pieces of pancake in her mouth. She winced with every bite. I first mistook her for an older woman, but on closer inspection, she was close to my age. I was seated straight across from her, at an opposite table. Dottie sat down with me halfway through my breakfast under the guise of offering me a refill for my coffee. "I'm sorry about your grandfather," she said. "Was it sudden?" "It was his time," I nodded. We just thought we had a little more left. Terrible, Dottie sighed, shaking her head. But the Lord knows when our time is due. Yeah, well, Eddie wasn't really a good friend of the church. Nonsense, we're all friends here. As she left the table, I found myself staring into the eyes of the woman at the opposite table, a thin gray membrane covering her eyes, as the machine pumped air into her lungs. But there, deep inside her dying orbs, was a strange shimmer, something I recognized from the many hours I spent with my grandfather. She knew something. She'd seen something. Something. I went back up to my room and got my things. I got Eddie's urn, put it in my backpack, and double-checked my email. I still had a life to attend to, even if I'd taken some time off for Eddie's sake. There were meetings being planned, Zoom calls to attend, never-ending spreadsheets. I was in a different headspace, thinking about the practicalities, so when I came face to face with the elderly couple I'd seen downstairs, my mind sort of blanked. They were standing literally outside my door, about to knock. They seemed just as surprised as I was. Hi, the old man said. Haven't seen you around before. Can I help you? I asked. We heard you were talking to, Dottie, the man continued, about your grandfather. Alright, yeah, he passed recently. The two of them nodded and looked at one another. There's someone you ought to talk to. Not knowing what to expect, I agreed to come along. They seemed harmless enough, and I didn't know where to begin with this town. Not that there was much to see. We took a long walk to the east side of town, past the gas station and supermarket. I could see the town church in the distance, blending into the white of the snow. The cemetery was on the other side of the hill. There were a few houses lining the side of the town, and at the far end of the road was a mansion made of eggshell white brick. There was a red mailbox with the name Saffron printed in large letters. Walking up to the door, an old man stepped out to greet us. He looked to be in his early 70s. He had a full head of long hair, a bright white and fully starched shirt, and a prominent gold cross necklace. The couple introduced me to him. This is Joel, they said. I'm sure he can straighten things out. I shook his hand, and we looked at each other for a few seconds in complete silence. Finally, I gave him my name. I'm so thankful for you to be here, he smiled. I'm sure you have many questions. Joel invited me into his house. The couple asked me to have a blessed day and disappeared into the bright winter sun. Joel offered me a glass of water and sat me down by the kitchen table. He had a spotless house except for some dead bugs in a windowsill. But everything had this slight smell of either detergent or chemical lemon. There was also a slight reverb to everything I did and said. I showed Joe my grandfather's urn and explained what happened. I told him about this mysterious obsession with the town, and this absolute determination to see it before his passing. Joel just looked at me, nodding. He was very easy to talk to, and was eager to ask follow-up questions. Finally, he took the urn gently and looked at it. I was in a similar predicament, he said. But the good Lord decided to keep me around for a few more years. Praise be. So, what was it that drove you here? I asked. Why this place? Joel thought about it carefully and put the urn down. He cleaned it with a napkin. I raced a lot of horses back on my ranch in Minnesota, he said. Beautiful place. Had these fields of sunflowers with the same colors as the sky. Looking out on a hazy morning as the sun rose, you might think you're looking into heaven. But with those horses grazing on the clouds, I smiled. Joel grinned. He patted me on the shoulder, nodding enthusiastically. I like that. Yes, like the horses grazing on the clouds above. What a gorgeous view. He turned in his seat, looking over at the urn, and lowered his voice. Slowly, his smile faded. But horses have this amazing ability, he said. They know when their time is over. They know when it's time for them to leave us behind to begin their journey to the pale beyond. They leave the comfort of their friends and family, walk into the field and die, face the sun as they fade. I never knew that. You won't read about that on your phone. Gotta talk to ranchers to know these things. Joel smiled, tapping the side of his temple. But they know, and so many other animals do too. They don't contemplate what has been or what will be. They just know what must be done, and they do it. Joel got up and showed me around. He had this spacious living room with a large cross covering an entire section of the wall. It looked hand-carved, as from a single piece of wood. But people are blessed with the gift of foresight, a gift to perceive things that haven't been, to remember things that have not happened to us, but to our forefathers. We imagine, we empathize, and when our time comes, we are conflicted with what has been and what will be, and we don't look to what currently is. Isn't that mindfulness? The idea of it? Yes, Joel interrupted. Of perceiving and living in the now. To so many of us, it just cannot be. Instead, we are filled with this terrible dread, this awful, hysterical fear of not knowing. Joel took a step towards me, looking at Eddie's urn. But passing away is easy as breathing, and I chose to believe in a world where we do not need to fear what comes naturally. Why should we fear dying any more than we fear being born or falling in love? Joel carefully took Eddie's urn from me, placing it on a coffee table in front of the large cross. He looked up. Sometimes people find that peace within themselves. They find that moment where they know their time is coming. And those people, much like my horses, find themselves drawn away from friends and family to a place where they're supposed to be. And that place is here. That's it, right here. And this is the place? This is where people go to die? Not all people, mind you, said Joel. But yes, many are drawn here. And when their time comes, this is where they choose to leave the world behind. Joel looked up at the cross, his eyes shimmering. Admiring the rising sun, grazing on a cloud of their own, ready to take their own peace among God's little wheat. I spent the afternoon with Joel, listening to his ideas and his story. Turns out he had a condition where his brain could suffer a sudden aneurysm. He lived, as he described it, on a constant balance of life and death, where he could drop dead at any second. And in that state of living, everything in the world pulled him to this place and time. Locust, South Dakota. He showed me a few articles about the town. The earliest mention of it were from the 1910s, when they built the church. The cemetery was built on top of a drained lake. There were little articles mentioning the town in passing, but it was just fluff pieces. Anniversaries, weddings, church events. The first real headlines came in the 60s during the cult craze, but it sort of faded over time. People were looking closely at all the off-map gatherings, but most agreed that the town of Locust were just particular, not heretical. But there was this one picture that I couldn't get out of my mind. This article from the 70s, when I could see dozens of people standing in a field, raising their arms to the sky in unison. They looked like scarecrows. Records speak about 10 to 30 people travel to Locust every year or so just to pass away. Most come from surrounding counties, but a few come all the way from Canada or northern Mexico. Joe told me about this one man who traveled all the way from Germany just to drop dead the moment he stepped inside the city limits. Later that day, we wandered back to the motel. Joel offered to treat me to Dottie's home-cooked meal. On the way there, I asked him a question that seemed obvious in hindsight. So, why is this town called Locust? Some consider it a misheard Lococodan word. Okus, meaning warm. I think it's a bit more complicated. Then, what do you think? Joel let the words sink in, and he looked up at the sky. The sun had already set, and the stars were coming out. He spoke, and the locusts came. Young locusts without number, said Joel. I love that verse. It reminds me that it's the word of God that brings the locusts. But in order for them to be brought, one has to listen. To hear the word of God, the locusts had to hear it spoken. But the locusts can't listen. I'm sorry, but that hardly makes sense. Don't you see? Joel smiled. We are the locusts. How else could we hear the word? How else could we be brought? That's an interpretation. I believe it to be a synonym of sorts. A word mean a sin or a sinful person. And that this, the town of Locust, is a place where one leaves their sin behind as we move beyond. Sitting down to eat with Joel and Dottie, I got the impression that this man was loved throughout the town. He was well-spoken, generous, and intensively friendly. The only one who didn't seem to warm up to his presence was the woman in the wheelchair with the oxygen tank, who seemed to shy away from everyone. You could see that twinkle in her eyes still. Maybe that's the look you get when you know your time is up. I spent the rest of the day in the company of Joel and Dottie. We had a long talk about the town's history and the various people who passed through over the years. Apparently, most people who died there are cremated, and the nearby graveyard has been full for years. So seeing that I brought Eddie in an urn was fitting somehow. Joel had already bought an urn for himself. He had no living relatives to care for his remains, so he didn't want to inconvenience anyone having to pay for them. By the end of the evening, I was walking under the starry sky with Joel and contemplating things that would come to be. I felt something, a little tug in my chest, this tiny strand leading directly to my heart to the field of locusts. I was feeling it, that distinct pull. Was I, too, about to die? What was supposed to be a weekend trip ended up being an entire week. I took time off just to get in touch with myself. I couldn't bring myself to say goodbye to Eddie yet. I'd do that on my last day. Instead, I spent my time getting to know the people of the town. Garland and Hannah, the elderly couple who introduced me to Joel, an older woman named Margaret, who idolized her late husband to the degree where she kept a shrine. There was a Masood who came all the way from Atlanta after it got its lung cancer diagnosis. There were about a dozen others that I noticed in passing, only getting to know them by name. But most of the days I spent listening to Joel. While I didn't care much for his impromptu sermons, I could appreciate his positive tone. It was comforting in a way, knowing something benevolent wanted me to be here at such a trying time. But the woman in the wheelchair never warmed up to me or Joel. I learned that her name was Erin, and that she had about a dozen chronic health issues. She was one of the few locals who was born and raised in Locust, as if she was never meant to leave. For all the people I talked to, not one had anything good to say about her. At best, they ignored her. Strange girl, Dottie said once. She has wanted to leave this town for years, but her body couldn't take it. So she just sits and waits. Out of all the people, one would think she would want to be here. One morning, as Dottie had gone to get bacon, I found myself alone with Erin in the dining room. As she removed her mask to place a piece of pancake in her mouth, I moved over to her table. She barely noticed. Once she did, she coughed. This awful, wheezing rattle. I introduced myself and asked if she wanted any help. "No," she wheezed. "I'm fine." "I heard you're not quite the fan of this town as most others," I said. "Is that right?" "Right," she said, steeling herself for another shot at her pancake. "Fuck this town." "Seems alright to me," I shrugged. "What's so bad about it?" She gave me a long look, as if trying to figure out if I was trained to be this dumb or if it was a natural talent. Finally, she shook her head. "God doesn't live in that fucking field," she said. "Whoever the fuck those people are praying to, it isn't divine." She had a point. Most people praise the town as some sort of holy ground, that it was special, that it was this magical place where people were supposed to be at the end of their life, that it was something beautiful and spiritual. But for people like Aaron, who just want to live, it's a cruel taunt. When your entire life revolves around your death, you start to curse being born. And the more I thought about it, the more the knot in my chest tightened. It didn't feel like a calling anymore. It felt like a trap, like a spider pulling me in, rather than guiding light leading the way. I empathized with Erin. If that was how she felt all the time, there was no wonder she resented that town. I decided to cut my extended visit short. I checked out the next morning, a few days ahead of what I paid for. Dottie didn't understand, and was eager to clear up whatever problem I'd encountered. I tried to explain that my time there was over, and that I needed to return to my own life. Dottie seemed crushed, as if she couldn't understand why anyone would want to leave. This was, after all, the place where we all would end up eventually. Why leave? Why not just get comfortable? Still, I got in my car. Dottie protested as I backed out of the driveway and broke the speed limit on my way out. I could imagine Erin smiling for the first time in years, knowing I left town because of her. But that tug in my chest grew stronger, insistent. My pulse rose. My body was trying to figure out why I was going the wrong way, like diving deeper when I needed to come up for air. I kept coming back to the same thought over and over. If this was the end station, why leave? Why not just stay and face my maker? To shed my sin, my locus, and rest pure in this perfect little town. I had to pull over. My pulse was going crazy, and I clutched my chest. It ached, setting red strains of pain pulsing through my arms. I closed my eyes to keep the tears in. Then I got a text. It was from Dottie. Apparently, I'd forgotten my grandfather's ashes. I came rolling back to the motel like a shamed dog. There was a whole bunch of people waiting for me in the parking lot. Joe was there, holding Eddie's bronze urn. They all looked at me with nothing but joy on their faces, like a lamb returning to the herd. They wanted me here. They wanted me to belong, and damn it all, there was intense relief being back. I parked and got out. Joel placed the urn on the roof of my car and wrapped me up in a big hug. The others awed and oohed. "We're gonna miss you," Joel said. "Are you sure you have to leave?" "I have to do what I came for," I said. "Eddie wanted to be here, not me." "Then I suppose we ought to get to church," said Joel. "What better place to lay to rest?" Eddie wasn't a big church guy. "Then maybe the hill overlooking the graveyard?" added Dottie. "It's beautiful up there." I thought about it. It wasn't quite the picture I imagined in my head when thinking about Eddie, but if that's what he wanted, that's what he'd get. "It's never too late," said Joel. "Not for him, not for you. If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things have passed away, and look, new things have come. Corinthians, added Garland. Praise be. We made our way through town, picking up more people as we went along. It was another beautiful day. The sun had started to melt in places, making the slush sink into my shoes. Some of those coming along had started singing psalms. Joel, on the other hand, seemed only to want to help. Excuse them, he whispered. They're just so eager to see someone join our congregation. I'm not joining you, I said. I know, nodded Joel, but he is. He tapped the side of Eddie's urn, and I got this sinking feeling like I was doing something terrible. I couldn't help but to think of what Aaron had said. God doesn't live in a field, so what the hell were we about to do, and for whom? We made our way off the road, continuing across a mushy field of melting snow. The others were singing, loudly and proudly, making the iron ball in my gullet grow. I felt sick. Still, part of me felt like this was the right place to be. But it felt right in an almost artificial sense, the same way a hot plate of French fries can be the best thing in the world, but you wouldn't want that forever. We finally got to the hill overlooking the church. There was this big Jupiter tree casting some morning shade on us, and I saw this vast clutter of tombstones below. For a town this small, the graveyard was enormous. The modest church was dwarfed next to it. As I took hold of the urn, I wanted to let Eddie go and be done with it. I wanted to do this and just leave, never looking back. I could live my life ignoring the pull to come back. That wouldn't be a problem. At least, I hope so. But at that moment, I was struggling to keep calm. Then Joel grabbed me by the arm. Let's take him closer to the cemetery, he said. Maybe you'll change your mind. I don't think I will, Joel. A walk never hurts anyone, he smiled. You got legs. Use them. He took me down to the cemetery as the others were singing to the full extent of their hearts. Even Dottie had joined in, her usual quiet voice booming with certainty. Joel led me by the arm, waving through the tombstones. Then, suddenly he stopped. He raised a hand. Can you feel it? He asked. Can you feel this place? I don't know what to feel. I couldn't tell him the truth. I felt ill, like my body was revolting. I cursed Aaron for putting that thought in my head, that this place wasn't what it's supposed to be, that there was something wrong, unholy at play. I deserted you for a brief moment, but will take you back with great compassion, sighed Joel. We all have doubts, but this is the right decision. This is his place. This is his home. I closed my eyes, the song reaching a fever pitch. Joel strengthened his grip on my arm. I turned the lid of Eddie's urn and felt the world shift. Something waiting to receive him, to welcome him. I will repay you for the years the swarming locust ate, spoke Joel. The young locust, the destroying locust, the devouring locust, my great army that I sent against you. Praise be, added Massaz. Praise him. And they praised him. They cheered him. They hollowed and raised their hands to the sky. And as I turned the lid, there was this weight building in my chest, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed this release. I needed to move on. Then I heard a strange noise, a beeping of sorts, an insistent, machine-like beeping. It was Erin, using her electronic honk of her wheelchair to grab my attention. She just sat there, staring at us. Not disappointed, not angry, just terrified. And for that brief moment, there was no shimmer in her look. She was just a scared girl, hoping against hope that I get my mind in order. All around me, I saw these people looking at me with dilated eyes, mouths open like animals waiting to bite, their arms shivering with excitement. And under my feet, the ground moved. It was subtle, but it was there, a bulge moving just beneath the earth, going from grave to grave, something massive, eagerly awaiting an offering. I looked up at Joel, still clenching my arm, and for the first time, I could see him clearly. This was a sickly man. He wasn't just old, he was ancient. I could see the outline of his skull, the lining of the veins reaching the end of his jaw muscles. He was more bone than man, and sunken eyes blackened with rot. "Let go," Joel wheezed. "Pass him on." Skeletal fingers wrapped around my arms, poking into my skin, beige teeth struggling to hide behind razor-thin lips. The cross around his neck, nothing but gold-colored nickel. How had I not seen this? I turned the lid back on tight and shrugged him off. There was an immediate gasp from the crowd. "What are you doing?" yelled Dottie. Masad got angry. Hannah and Garland snarled like animals. Margaret wielded her walking stick like a sword. And behind them were the nameless crowd we'd gathered on our way there, most of which barely even looked human. Some were little more than bone and sinew, others were so pale their skin seemed translucent. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Aaron beeped again, snapping me to attention. Clutching the urn tight, I tried to push my way past Joel and burst into a sprint. He tripped me, and I dropped the urn. Luckily, the lid held tight. Bronze doesn't break easily. I fell flat on my stomach as the ground beneath me moved. As the bulge buckled, a crack in the ground revealed something underneath. A pulsing, segmented body, white as snow, covered in thick mucus. It bobbed back and forth like the abdomen of a wasp. It stank of dog's breath. It must have been at least 7 feet wide. A hand gripped my ankle, dragging me back into the crowd. Joel stood ahead of me, lifting the urn. "You have already committed him," he said. "You can't go back on your word. A bond has been made, and the price must be paid. Would you deny your loved one's salvation?" I struggled, hands grasping me, lifting my head, forcing me to watch. The iron ball in my stomach felt like an egg ready to hatch. I wanted to beg for forgiveness, but not from whatever god they praised, but from my grandpa. I shouldn't have taken him here to begin with. I should have known better. Joel held the urn high, speaking at the top of his lungs. "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come on you, and you will be my witness in Jerusalem, in all of Judea and Samaria." He leaned down and looked me in the eye, to the cheers of the ghostly mass of those dying and those that had long since passed. And I knew in that moment that this wouldn't end with Eddie. This wouldn't end until I was part of their congregation, dead in the ground. Joel smiled, knowing that I finally understood. "And," he grinned, "to the ends of the earth." There was a metallic clang. I felt hands release me as the congregation panicked. There, right behind Joel, was Erin. She'd gotten up from her chair, hobbled all the way over, and whacked him over the head with her oxygen tank. As Joel crumbled to the ground, they let me go. I managed to twist free, picking up Eddie's urn as I got up. I hurried towards Erin, leaning her against me. She barely weighed anything. We looked at the crowd of devotees, staring us down with animal intent. They were horrified, angered, and beyond reasoning. There was no doubt these people would tear us to pieces for our transgressions. There were more of them now. So many more. Joel lifted a finger towards us, cradling the back of his bleeding skull. "You," he cursed. You've denied him. You've resented him. You've come bearing false witness. You. A rumble. A low, deep rumble. Then a buzz. A locust. It landed on my arm, then took off, but the entire congregation just stared, awestruck. The silence that crept up on us was so intense. I could hear the wind in the Jupiter tree on the hill. Then I saw them. Hundreds of locusts crept out of the ground. In the cracks where the thing beneath had broken through, they escaped. Joel had promised it a meal, but it had been denied. And that wouldn't stop it, however. It hungered. It would eat, no matter what or whom. The locusts first started crawling up Joe's leg, then Dottie's. On Masad, they started with his hands. Margaret had them crawling on her neck. Hannah and Garland held each other, keeping the song alive. I saw the first drops of blood in the snow. There was a sudden jolt as the ground shifted. Joel's foot sank into the earth with a sickening crunch. He looked down, then back up at me, his bone-like face aching to a smile. "Joy," he screamed. "Joy to be chosen." Aaron tapped my shoulder, reminding me to do what came most natural, to run. The cemetery erupted. Thousands of locusts swarmed the air, tearing the congregation to pieces, stripping them of their clothes, their skin, their hair. I could hear them choking as a swarm of creatures forced themselves down their throats. But there were no screams, just songs and praises, joyous laughter as they held one another, thanking whatever God may be. But in seconds, their songs were drowned with pitter-patter of air-thin wings. And as we ran, despite being 30 feet away, I could still feel the ground shift. Aaron kept smacking me on my arm, like trying to get a racehorse to go faster. As I got Aaron to her wheelchair, the entire cemetery was engulfed in a mixture of gray and brown, like a descending cloud, a filthy, buzzing cloud, tearing everything into base components, stripping everyone of their identity and purpose. All the while, Joel was laughing. His deathly smile never faded as he sunk into the earth, the greatest joy of his life, to be devoured by whatever god he praised, chunk by chunk. I got bitten 12 times in less than a minute. I didn't even know locusts could do that. Erin had them stuck in her hair, in her oxygen mask, everywhere. We tried to brush them off as I hurried down the hill, back to the motel. By the time we got to my car, the swarm had already descended from the church. These things were everywhere. I could hear them smacking into the windows of the motel with a rhythmic tapping. There was no question about getting Erin out of here. She was coming with me. I dropped her into the passenger seat and started folding up her wheelchair. She smacked me again, accidentally brushing off a biting locust. "Leave it," she wheezed. "Let's go." There was a dozen in the car with us, but we had to go. I could hear them rattling in the air conditioning. For the second time that day, I backed out of the driveway and broke the speed limit. On my way out of town, I felt that tug in my heart, that thing in me telling me that I was misunderstanding everything, that I was letting myself down, that I was breaking a holy convent, and that some things were not meant to be understood by people like me, that there was a reason that the first thing angels said when they reveal themselves to mortals was not to be afraid. My chest ached, a red pulse forced me to blink, sweat stung my eyes. Erin placed a hand on mine. All she had was half an oxygen tank, and a way out of town that seemed more than enough. "I'm scared too," she said. "Keep going." So I did. We were halfway to Rapid City when I slowed down, easing my cramped foot. The locust had died. My mind was quiet. Eddie's urn rests carefully on Erin's lap, and as I looked over at her, I saw the gray membrane clear from her eyes. She took off the oxygen mask, breathing freely, and smiled. This was some time ago. I don't expect everyone to believe me, but if you look it up, Locust, South Dakota is still there. Maybe new people have moved in, others who felt the call. I found the perfect spot for Eddie. There's this place not far from his childhood home where you can watch the fishermen bring in the catch of the day. All year long, you can smell fresh crab stew, Eddie's favorite. I knew he'd love it there. At first, I thought Erin was going to die. Turns out many of her problems weren't as bad as we imagined. Sure, she had some muscle atrophy from spending years in that chair, but physical therapy would go a long way. Apparently, there'd never been anything wrong with her eyes, and her lung problems were inconclusive. The doctor feared it was some sort of perpetual allergy reaction, probably to insect bites. Away from that town, Erin looks to make an almost full recovery. I don't know what to make of all this. I think there are plenty of reasons for people to go to places and find comfort in their beliefs. I think there are good reasons for us to deal with what we are and what we will become. Much like all the people on Locust, we find our comforts in knowing we belong in this world, even when we're gone. Thinking back on all this, I think Joel was right about one thing. That leaving this life behind is nothing to be feared. That it's as natural as being born or falling in love. That it is reasonable to have faith in a merciful and benevolent Creator, whatever form that might take. But I know that none of that benevolence and none of that mercy lived in the town of Locust, South Dakota. After months of my daughter being distant from the two of us, my husband and I rejoiced when she agreed to a family game night of Cluedo. Putting down her piece, she said to us, "The teenager in the bathroom with a coat hanger." And now the stories have come to an end. If you're still awake, well, I hope you fall asleep shortly. And the sounds that you hear in the background are going to take center stage for no more than 30 minutes to help you fall asleep or stay asleep. But if you are awake and want to hear more stories, I do have playlists for that as well. Sleep tight and don't let 42 bite.